After 7 years of complex research, an informer suddenly got in touch with our film team and said he wants to hand over certain documents. Secret documents kept under lock and key at Germany's Federal Intelligence Service, the BND. The BND got a shipping company to transport arms to crisis regions. Our informer knew this, but he kept quiet, and today those regions are war zones. We have arranged to meet at a remote location. Our contact thought mailing the documents to us seemed too risky, even now, 10 years on. We are given the shipping company stowage plans for arms transports. The documents also include photos of tanks in a ship's hold. Tanks for a brutal military dictatorship, supplied despite an embargo. We are also given the freight papers of other ships and finally a computer stick, and that is it. The stowage document shows how 80 tanks have to be positioned in order to get all of them on board. The shipping company's plan: to deliver a consignment of tanks to Islamic North Sudan. The documents also include a manifest: tanks, guns, and ammunition for delivery to Kenya. But the arms were ordered by GOS, the government of South Sudan. Controlled by rebels at the time, South Sudan was in the process of separating from Sudan. The military junta in Myanmar was also supplied with tanks, seen here in a ship's hold. The shipping company which delivered the arms is said to be Beluga, owned by Niels Stolberg. Stolberg agreed to an interview. He wanted to present a different image from other ship owners, seen as someone who staged fundraising concerts, supported social projects, and dreamt of ecological ship propulsion technology. So how can that be reconciled with transporting arms? We confronted Stolberg. Arms to South Sudan and Myanmar? Doesn't that embarrass you?
I personally am very sorry if we carried freight that should not have been carried. There's no question of that.
But you did.
Yes, we chartered ships out and had no idea that certain goods were on board and were transported to highly sensitive regions. We were unaware of that.
Stolberg, the award-winning entrepreneur and self-styled world market leader. Captivated by his success, banks financed the construction of his ships in China, one after another until he had a fleet of 80 vessels. His headquarters in Bremen, northern Germany. The architecture is representative, the location maritime. Stolberg laid the emphasis on size, but then came the shipping crisis. Stolberg earned less and less with his ships. The rising losses were hidden in his balance sheets, but it was all to no avail. After all, the entire world market was collapsing. Under such circumstances, lucrative arms transports were the perfect solution. Stolberg Shipping Company charged $1,094,687 for 2 consignments of tanks to Myanmar. Another lucrative deal involved the Beluga Endurance. The vessel transported tanks, ammunition and guns from Oktyabrsk in the Ukraine to Mombasa in Kenya. The arms were then taken on towards South Sudan by Kenyan railways. Kenya, 2008. New tanks being transported through the country by rail. In Mombasa, several ships have unloaded arms of this kind, not only the Beluga Endurance. Under the gaze of the Kenyan military, a ship carrying weapons berths. This time, it is a Ukrainian vessel. A soldier and an expert sent specially from the Ukraine watch as the cargo hatch opens. Some of the crew have left the ship and look on. Guarded by soldiers, the heavy cargo is unloaded. Yet another consignment for GOS, the rebels in South Sudan. Loaded like other vessels before it in the Ukraine. Now everything has arrived. The president of the Ukraine has sent the head of his foreign intelligence service to hand over a present. The message: our weapons are for you Kenyans, not the South Sudan, even though we know that they were ordered by Goss. The head of the Secret Service is uneasy during the ceremony. Later he told us that his president did not have the arms trade under control and that German ships also secretly loaded weapons in the Ukraine. We're on our way to Oktyabrsk, the name of a secret port and a kind of arms bazaar where, until 2014, Russian and Ukrainian state-run companies offered weapons for export. The port lies hidden some 100 kilometers east of Odessa. It took us a long time to find it. The place was not marked on any map. The Beluga Endurance loaded arms in Oktyabrsk, as did the Beluga Eternity. These photos of the hold on the Beluga Eternity, which were taken secretly, are some of the documents that were leaked to us. Long before the ship with the weapons set out, a certain Klaus Hollmann sent an email to the shipping company. Good morning. What's the situation with the sensitive transport? The key word is sensitive, because there is an EU embargo in place with regard to Myanmar and its dictatorial government. Despite this, the shipping company planned to send a consignment of arms there. In another email, Hollmann made the shipping company a job offer. Tanks for Yemen, a country where a civil war is now raging. His exact words to the director responsible for chartering at the firm's vessels were, "Yemen is currently procuring a large number of tanks. That should be of interest to you. Regards, Klaus Hollmann." The shipping company CEO remembers.
Mr. Hollmann was on the staff of the Federal Intelligence Service. He simply said how things were to be handled and how not.
But it was a sensitive cargo.
It was a sensitive consignment. I reckon that he came to see us maybe once every 2 or 3 months and simply told us how things were to be handled and how not. In other words, it was important for us to proceed according to certain regulations and not to engage in any illegal transport.
So basically he or the BND decided what was on and what wasn't.
Exactly.
This is how the system worked. Hollmann maintained contact with the Beluga shipping company for the BND. When the company planned an arms transport, it asked Hollmann whether he saw a problem. If he didn't, Stolberg gave the go-ahead and the ship sailed. For example, a vessel was supposed to take a consignment of tanks, rockets and ammunition to the Congo. The plan was to load the arms in the secret Ukrainian port of Oktyabrsk. The arms cargo was coordinated by the shipping company's chartering director. He wrote to Neil Stolberg, saying that he had sorted everything with regard to the Congo consignment. The ship, he said, could sail. He had, of course, been in touch with Hollmann from the BND and been told that there was no problem. Referring to Hollmann from the BND, who didn't see any problem, the manager asked his boss for his okay. Stolberg wrote back okay, and the ship sailed. Documents, photos, papers. Time and again, it was all about whether Hollmann saw any problem with an arms transport. We've also obtained an internal report drawn up by the ZKA, the German Customs Investigation Bureau. In it, the ZKA examines the link between Hollmann and the shipping company. Based on a staggering 9 terabytes of seized data, the BND must also have the report. At the BND's headquarters in Berlin, we were given the cold shoulder. A spokeswoman told us that the intelligence agency would only discuss operative aspects of its work with the federal government and federal parliamentary committees. That was a pity because we would love to have shown the BND certain documents. So instead we showed them to Secret Service expert Erich Schmidt-Einbohm. He sees a complex BND operation at Beluga behind the work of a man codenamed Hollmann.
He's a typical BND initiator and liaison officer who has been commissioned by a specific department to implement arms transports. That, of course, is why he cultivates links with Beluga. The email communications show quite clearly that he was authorized to present himself as someone who could give official approval.
Hollmann probably works somewhere in the middle hierarchy of the BND. How can I find out what his real name is?
That is incredibly difficult. After all, his code name is designed to hide his civil identity and thus prevent any investigative authority gaining direct access to his real name. So it's really difficult because the intelligence service is able to mask identities, even by going as far as to issue forged identity papers.
The BND cannot be expected to provide any indication of who Hollmann really is and what his brief was with regard to the Beluga shipping company. Fortunately, though, we have good contact to someone who knows Hollmann personally. Neil Stolberg. Here, the captain of a cutter who is an old friend of his is taking Stolberg from the mainland across to the island of Spiekeroog in the North Sea. We are also on board. Stolberg has agreed to give us an interview on his favourite island. He used to own houses and a villa on Spiekeroog. Before, that is, his shipping company went under, and before he was summoned to the public prosecutor's office in Bremen. The office had been investigating Stolberg since 2011 on suspicion of serious embezzlement and fraud, including fraudulent accounting and loan fraud. Now, 7 years later, after a long court case, during the course of which Stolberg fell seriously ill, he is on his way to Spiekeroog with us to talk about everything.
I'm a fighter. I've had surgery 3 times for cancer. And now I'm going into the new year with this on my plate.
Stolberg literally had to drag himself into the courtroom, but he hung on, and today he's in better shape. The trial lasted 68 days. Stolberg was sentenced to 3.5 years in prison, but he appealed. That is why he's still at liberty. We've come to meet him by the sea. Transporting industrial plants on heavy-duty ships made Stolberg a wealthy man. But his shipping company also offered to transport arms, and he drew up plans illustrating how tanks should be stowed in order to prevent a ship from listing. Stolberg named the shipping company after the beluga whale. He was impressed by the animal's social behavior. Under the flag bearing the whale's tail fin, Stolberg telephoned not only with customers who wanted to have civilian goods transported, but also with Hollmann whenever arms transports were planned. And he met Hollmann personally. What did Hollmann look like? What kind of person was he?
I'm sorry, but I really can't tell you exactly. I met Hollmann maybe 2 or 3 times. He then had a few meetings with a colleague of mine and things were discussed.
Was he big or small? Did he have a large nose or a small one?
I don't know.
Firm handshake?
I don't know.
Aftershave?
I don't know.
That's a pity.
I really can't say.
It's not enough for an identikit picture, but from the recollections of one shipping company employee whom we asked, a graphic artist was able to sketch some of Hollmann's features. He was a rather squat figure, more on the small side. He was also well groomed, especially his hands. The nails were always neatly manicured. What's more, his parting was always straight, and he had always a perfect wet shave. He was always so well groomed. Casually or formally dressed? Perfect elegance?
I don't know. Really, I'm sorry, but I don't know.
Hollmann always wore shirts that were crisply pressed. Indeed, everything about him, we heard, was sheer elegance. He was about 50 years old. But Hollmann was there and advised you on these sensitive issues.
That all happened some 10 years ago. So I can't remember exactly.
So we now know that Hollmann was well dressed and knew all about arms transports on Beluga ships. And we know that Stolberg doesn't like talking about those transports. He refuses to snitch on Hollmann and is not prepared to talk about Oktyabrsk, the secret port in the Ukraine.
Can we perhaps make a brief cut?
Kiev, the capital of the Ukraine. It took 8 months for us to get an appointment with the politician who knows everything about the secret port Stolberg refuses to talk about. An appointment with the politician who sent the head of his intelligence service to Kenya. Our appointment is with the former president of the Ukraine. Viktor Yushchenko outlined how Putin is destroying the Ukraine through his occupation of the Crimea. Putin, the enemy. But he dodged questions on Russo-Ukrainian arms deals that took place via Oktyabrsk during his presidency.
The president himself did not sell any pistols or rifles or any other arms. Our state-run arms export company, Uzbeksport, had its own guidelines, which were also passed by the cabinet and approved by the National Security Council of the Ukraine. So everything was perfectly legal. The Ukraine has always observed current legislation. Nonetheless, this business is highly delicate.
Footage of one delicate deal. Tanks being unloaded from the Fina, a Ukrainian vessel. Normally this would be a clandestine operation, but this time the press were watching. Pirates had kidnapped the ship, and when the crew were allowed to disembark in Mombasa, the cameras were present. The Fina was one of several vessels which transported Ukrainian weapons ordered by Goss. According to the former head of the Secret Service, the president no longer had the arms trade under control.
I know Yushchenko well. We spent a lot of time together. He played down our arms exports, saying there was no corruption. Yet I pointed out to him several times that corruption was involved. But for him, it was all perfectly normal. Such established structures simply existed, he said.
Mykola Malamush showed us Kiev. He told us about Beluga, saying that a secret dossier existed. The shipping company was regarded as reliable, but it too was under investigation. However, nothing had been proven. That, he said, was all he was allowed to tell us.
Beluga.
We chatted about the German Secret Service and learned that he once met the president of the BND. We asked if he had already seen the fine new building the BND had been given. Of course, he said, and laughed.
Yes.
We then arrived at the comparatively modest building housing the Ukrainian Foreign Intelligence Service, the SBU. Until 2010, Malamush was the boss here, and they still listen to him even today. Don't worry, he tells the guard. It's German television, everything is okay. His office is somewhere else, near the parliament. He wants to go into politics. As head of the Secret Service, he told us he knows all about the secret port of Oktyabrsk, the arms bazaar.
It's actually a good model. The port was controlled by our secret services and also by Russia's. But behind the official facade, there was a shadowy economy in the port and corruption. As a result, large quantities of arms could be transported secretly without us being able to keep check on what was stored there or being loaded. Some ships didn't have any manifest at all. Others put to sea with forged papers. The port was a hub for hidden arms consignments.
Oktyabrsk, the secret port. Stored here were tanks, missiles, guns, and even field kitchens. Everything required for a regional war, and observed by C4ADS, an organization from Washington. Its director is a lieutenant colonel who speaks Russian and Arabic and was trained at West Point Military Academy. Prior to our interview, the researcher on the left brought the director up to speed on Oktyabrsk. C4ADS had focused on the port because of its arms turnover, and according to David Johnson, it wasn't easy to research. Indeed, the port lies hidden and is hard to access.
You could certainly see it with satellite imagery, but it was not a port that was readily, easily accessed. They had gate guards, there were few roads leading into it, it was out in a restricted area farther away from the city, out in the countryside to a certain extent on that point on the Bug River. It certainly had gates and controls.
We made our first attempt to see the port in 2013. This is just the first of 3 guarded gates. We weren't allowed any further. Seamen had described to us what it used to look like in the port when they were there to load their ships. Behind the ships, they said, there were arms as far as you could see, and hanging from the cranes were tanks.
The shipments are global. This is going around to countries where there are lots of conflict going on. Eritrea, you're looking at Latin America, Venezuela, you're looking at places in Asia. You're looking at places further south in Africa, like the Democratic Republic of the Congo or the South Sudan.
5 years later, we're back. And this time we're allowed in. Congo, Kenya, Sudan, Myanmar, and Yemen. Whenever Beluga planned an arms transport, this port was always involved. Secret Service boss Malamush had promised to ring up those in charge of the port. Perhaps that is why we were allowed to simply drive through. In fact, we were even given a musical reception. The port bosses welcomed us. On the left, the Director of Security, the Grey Eminence. On the right, the Union Leader, a kind of Labour Director, and in the middle, a watchdog. First, we were served tea. Then we engaged in small talk. The press spokesperson explained the regulations we would have to observe afterwards in the port. Then the Labour Director indicated that it was time to get going. As he still had things to do, he wouldn't be accompanying us. So the Security Director became our guide. At first, it wasn't quite clear whether we would be able to film from our vehicle. The situation was tense. After all, we were the first television team ever to pitch up here with a camera. "This is where we stop," the Director of Security said. Then he issued clear instructions. "You can't shoot anything you want. That's okay in this direction, but not in the other direction where the underground warehouses are located. Not even afterwards with the drone. Only in this direction."
So it's a secret port.
Это секретный порт.
Относительно.
Yeah, you can say so, not exactly, but
Потому что мы
partly.
перерабатываем
To a certain extent, we load commercial goods and sometimes special goods, chemicals or explosive materials.
химические, вредные, разрядные, взрывчатые материалы.
"What about arms?" the interpreter asks.
Those too.
The cargo with military, yes.
For the time being, the days of the big arms business are over, because Russian tanks are no longer loaded here. But up until 2014, David Johnson told us Norwegian, Ukrainian, Russian, Danish and German vessels used to put in here. At the jetty where the port people have moored a lovely grain carrier for us, German shipping companies used to berth, including 2 from the Bremen area.
So the ones in the report that we identified were Brise, as well as a Beluga, which I believe is no longer solvent, because they have special skills that are required. Now, in particular, the German shipping companies that we looked into while we were working on this report were capable of moving heavy cargo. They were specialized ships that had cranes. And usually you want that kind of ship if you're going to a port destination where they may not have the cranes to unload the heavy cargo.
A tank weighs 40 tons. In addition to tanks, the powerful cranes in Oktyabrsk also heaved missile launchers and heavy ammunition boxes on board. Moored to the jetty are the Beluga Endurance, which will be taking arms to Kenya, and the Beluga Eternity, which, despite an EU embargo, will be transporting arms to Myanmar. The Beluga Eternity will be stopping in Bremen for a few hours. Shipping company CEO Neil Stolberg is paying a brief visit. He likes to be seen with his people. Immediately afterwards, the ship set sail for the Ukrainian port of Oktyabrsk with arms for Myanmar on board. Following an initial consignment in 2007, the generals will be getting more tanks, ammunition and guns brought by the Beluga Eternity. The shipping company sent Hollmann the shipping list for Myanmar and asked whether he saw any problems. Instead of stopping the consignment, Hollmann asked to be sent photographs of the arms being unloaded in Myanmar. Yet long beforehand he had warned that the EU had embargoed the country. The shipping company charged $360,937.50 for the transport, and Hollmann cast his BND in a positive light with the generals.
In other words, the BND gained favor with the generals in Myanmar by enabling them to obtain heavy military equipment despite the existence of international embargoes.
Bremen public prosecutor Frank Posada investigated the Beluga shipping company because of Myanmar. Hollmann, he says, played the decisive role, not the shipping company, because it, of course, was relying on the BND.
Where this kind of business is involved and you're in contact with a BND operative and instructed not to transport a certain consignment, you would be well advised to comply.
And what if he gives you the go-ahead?
Then I think you can feel you're in good hands.
Because the BND is ultimately responsible?
The general conception is that if such consignments are transported with the knowledge of a federal authority, then it is all legally acceptable.
In investigating the Beluga shipping company for evidence of white-collar crime, this is archive footage, Posada came across an initial arms transport to Myanmar by the Beluga Enterprise in 2007, and a further transport by the Beluga Eternity in 2009. The transport Hollmann was involved in. He and the shipping company were thus suspected of a joint breach of the EU embargo against Myanmar and its ruling generals. Nevertheless, the arms brought by the Beluga Eternity were personally received by General Cho Kwa Kain. Unfortunately, we do not have a photograph of him. The maximum penalty for breaking an embargo is a 5-year jail sentence, but as the public prosecutor tells us, imposing it is not that easy.
Consignments only come under the embargo restriction if they are destined for a specific listed person and if the goods are destined for that person's own private use. However, the tanks were delivered to the Ministry of Defense, and the listed person only took receipt of the arms on behalf of the Ministry of Defense. He did not receive them personally. And so, from a legal point of view, no violation of the EU embargo restrictions actually took place. Thus, with no criminality involved, the investigation had to be discontinued.
But that's absurd.
It is hard to understand.
Frank Posada discontinued his investigation into Hollmann and shipping company CEO Neil Stolberg.
The public prosecutor's office in Bremen ought to try and reopen proceedings with fresh elan and really exert pressure on the federal chancellery. Unfortunately, it doesn't have the same operative possibilities as Italian public prosecutors, who were always brazen enough to enter Secret Service headquarters and seize papers.
The charges against Hollmann from the BND are serious. According to the Customs investigation report, one shipping company employee told the public prosecutor that Hollmann approved the arms consignments to Myanmar. In Myanmar, the military reacted. While Hollmann was asking the shipping company for pictures of the tanks being unloaded, opposition politician San Suu Kyi was being sentenced once again. The BND has made no comment on Hollmann. The investigation into his activities were discontinued. So what was there to get excited about? Plenty, says Fridtjof Schmidt, a long-standing EU development politician responsible for Southeast Asia. He was in Myanmar when the arms arrived. Today, he is a member of the Parliamentary Commission on Foreign Affairs.
Naturally, the BND should have informed the German government. After all, that is its duty. It's supposed to gather information on what is happening politically, like when an embargo imposed by the European Union is breached, an embargo supported and countersigned by the federal German government. Violating this embargo is an offence against German international politics. If the BND receives information on this, it is duty-bound to inform the government. Otherwise, we are talking about a political scandal.
With Hollmann, the BND is firmly in place at Beluga, and not only with regard to Myanmar. When the shipping company planned to transport tanks destined for North Sudan, Hollmann was well informed. But hadn't the company just transported tanks to Kenya? Tanks whose recipient, according to the manifest, was GOS, the rebels in South Sudan? Didn't Hollmann know what GOS stood for? Didn't he see a link between the transports for South Sudan and the tanks brought by the Beluga vessel and the tanks for GOS brought by other ships? In 2014, civil war broke out in the fledgling state of South Sudan, a conflict in which there was no shortage of weapons, something we'd like to have discussed with Hollmann. Brussels is home to an eyewitness who saw the tanks for GOS in South Sudan. He was in the country on behalf of the Bonn International Center for Conversion, a peace research institute. Luc van der Vondervoort met members of the South Sudan military. These are pictures of his visit. Shortly before the civil war erupted and 5 years after the ships brought the arms, he inspected a small arms store which we see here. As it happens, the general showed him something really grand.
The first time I specifically remember seeing these T-72s was at the SPLA main headquarters around Bilpam, because they were just stationed there as to guard the compound. I think that's a particularly effective way of guarding your compound, but the general himself said, "Do you want us to drive around?" So it felt really bizarre, almost like they were showing them off to us. Look at the kind of stuff that we have here. Look at how we can drive them around and show you how impressive our... Yeah, they were incredibly proud. And I remember saying to my colleague, "Is this a good idea?" Because those were the tanks that they were not supposed to have. But apparently the SPLA itself thought it was no problem.
According to a secret dispatch from the US government, the American Secret Service has satellite pictures proving the tanks were delivered to GOS in South Sudan. The cargo documents for the Beluga Endurance show tanks, field howitzers and machine guns ordered by GOS. Niels Stolberg dismisses any involvement.
We knew nothing about that.
But Stolberg's people did plan arms transports, and not only for North Sudan. And Stolberg gave his okay for arms consignments for the Congo. Then came the job offer. Keyword, Yemen. We showed the BND expert the email once again. "How about it?" Hollmann wrote in the email, and asked the shipping company if it wanted to transport tanks to Yemen from the Ukrainian port of Oktyabrsk.
The content of this email is highly instigating. It proves quite clearly that Mr. Hollmann is flouting Article 25 of the German Constitution, which criminalizes any attempt to disturb the peaceful relations between nations.
According to an internal report of the German Customs Investigation Bureau, investigators counted 426 emails between Hollmann and the shipping company's chartering director. The two discussed sensitive ships' cargoes, and sometimes they wrote to each other in encoded language. The chartering director, seen on one day of the trial at the district court in Bremen. The former manager ended his time with Beluga with his integrity totally intact. He had nothing to do with his boss's white-collar crime. The investigation into his activities with regard to the arms transport to Myanmar was closed, but he refused to grant us an interview. Niels Stolberg was charged with embezzlement and various forms of fraud. After proceedings lasting 60 days, the public prosecutor gave his closing argument. The same public prosecutor who had dropped the investigation into Stolberg because of the arms transports wanted a sentence of 4.5 years for white-collar crime. Tank consignments transported on Niels Stolberg's ships were not an issue. Eric Schmidt-Einbohm has no problem with that. In his view, responsibility for that must be borne by Hollmann from the BND.
The ship owner felt he was in the right, and it's possible that he was also aware that what he was doing was wrong. At the same time, however, he knew that he could not be brought to task for it since he was acting under the instructions of the Federal Intelligence Service.
We discovered a few facts about Hollmann, but only of a private nature. He likes playing cards, preferring that to taking his wife to the opera, which he finds yucky. He likes dining out, occasionally with his contact at Beluga. Pointing out to him in an email, however, that in Bremen the man should find somewhere decent. Hollmann lives in Hamburg, but we couldn't determine who he is or whether he also had contact with other shipping companies. Hollmann was incriminated by his contact at Beluga. The manager told the public prosecutor that Hollmann had considered an arms transport to Myanmar to be legitimate and possible. That is stated in the document of the Customs Investigation Bureau. The public prosecutor does not know Hollmann's identity.
At first, when we planned to put the BND employee on the witness stand, the BND was quite prepared to grant permission for him to give evidence. However, that permission was withdrawn when we pressed charges against him. Due process requires every accused to be granted the right to a fair hearing. So we were then approached by a lawyer representing the accused BND employee. He asked to inspect the files. This request was granted, and afterwards a statement was made on behalf of the BND employee.
So you never got to question him as the accused?
No, not personally. It's actually inconceivable in a constitutional state for a public prosecutor to allow someone under an assumed name to make a statement via a lawyer when, as the accused, he ought to be questioned in court.
On one occasion, the word Beluga in the names of 4 ships belonging to the Beluga Shipping Company was painted over. The vessels then set sail. On the Mediterranean, they secretly took on board phosphorus bombs from another ship from Hamburg, which had loaded the weapons in the United States, with Israel as their destination. Hollmann was fully aware of this clandestine operation. But why was the word Beluga, which Niels Stolberg was always so proud of, painted over? What exactly were Hollmann and the shipping company doing?
Naturally, Mr. Hollmann also wanted information from us about certain cargo flows. And so we, of course, complied. As a German shipping company, it was our responsibility, so we provided him with the information.
What information?
Well, he wanted to know, for instance, what kind of cargoes were on the market, and we provided him with that information.
So we're talking about tanks, guns and so on?
Exactly.
Stolberg told us that he had a clear conscience, that the BND was always in the picture, and that Hollmann gave his approval. But he hasn't got over the loss of his company. Even after an investor had taken over the financially distressed company, he tried to work through what he had experienced by writing a book. He showed us some of the first passages. Hired by the investor, bodyguards had thrown him out of his company. Mombasa, Kenya. Ships have a direct link to the rail system. This ship is being unloaded by Ukrainian technicians. The tanks transported here for Goss will continue their onward journey straight away. But doesn't South Sudan have a legitimate interest in arming itself and establishing itself as a state?
Well, it was an integral part of the Sudan and fought for independence. But in a situation like that, where one side says it wants to prevent independence and the other side says it wants to systematically prepare for it, anyone supplying weapons must know that there is a strong likelihood of arms being used in a possible war of independence. There could be a political motivation to promote the separation of a region because of the presence of deposits of oil or raw materials, but that is clearly in violation of international law and thus unacceptable. It is, of course, a humanitarian crime.
South Sudan in 2014. Its president, Salva Kiir, the man with the hat, was armed to the teeth and waged war. Not on Islamic North Sudan, as many had predicted, but on his former fellow fighters in the rebel war. On the young republic's vice president, Riek Machar, and he mobilized his forces against the president. Today, there are Kalashnikovs galore in South Sudan, and even more powerful weapons. Now, each side can really stick it to the other.
We didn't know that.
The Beluga Endurance transported tanks to Kenya. It cannot be proved that the shipping company knew that the client hiding behind the name Goss was South Sudan. The consignment of tanks for North Sudan was transported by another shipping company. The arms transport for the Congo was cancelled. The new investor who took over the Beluga shipping company no longer wanted to carry out such transport solely with the backing of Hollmann. 7 years of research. Now, only Parliament can shed light on the BND's Operation Hollmann.